Namaste. My name is Nadine McNeil, and it is an absolute privilege to be able to contribute to this important training, Unwind the Feminine, Yoga for Stress and Anxiety. I am here on faculty full-time at the Yoga Barn, and it's a real privilege to be sharing on a topic that's very close to my heart, namely how race, gender, yoga, and a bit of humanitarianism intersect and collide. So I'll begin by sharing a bit about myself, and much of what I'd like to offer is born out of my first person story. To say that we're living in interesting times is an understatement. I like to describe it almost as a dive into the underworld, as it were. And so this is a real opportunity for us to rebirth ourselves. And in the process of that rebirth, we get to look at some stuff that has made us and previous generations really uncomfortable. I liken the story that I'm personally living. What it feels like to me at this point is the story of the goddess Inanna, also known as Ishtar. And just to share a bit about that story, her brother-in-law dies, and she decides she wants to be with her sister while she mourns. So, in order for her to be with her sister, she has to take a journey into the underworld. And as she journeys to the underworld, she passes through 7 gates. And at each gate, an aspect of herself is removed. And by the time she arrives, she is naked. She arrives, her sister takes one look at her, and she's killed. And then she's put to hang on a hook like a piece of rotting meat. Before she began this journey, she checked in with her maid and said, if I do not come back in X amount of time, come searching for me. And she gave her explicit instructions. I'm not quite naked yet, but I'm pretty close. So how did I arrive at yoga? I'm from Jamaica. I lived in Jamaica until I was 16 years old. And then I went off to school in Canada. And then I joined the UN in my early 20s. And as a result of joining the UN, I was blessed to see the world serving mainly in the field of emergency preparedness and disaster response. And as I traveled the world and saw natural disasters, human disasters, man-made disasters, it rocked me to the core. And so therein laid the foundation, as it were, for my yoga practice. I started practicing yoga shortly after 9/11. I was living in Holland at the time. And at that point, my practice was intermittent, shall we say. I came from a very physical background. I was very much into gyms and lifting weights and running. And I had a series of life experiences that started to occur around my mid-30s. An engagement fell apart, betrayal by a best friend. And I remember I met a woman who became and still is one of my mentors and teachers. And she said to me that she read tea leaves, she read coffee cups, pardon me. And when she looked in my coffee cup, one of the things that she says, it's almost as though you're an orphan, even though you come from a family and you have 2 parents, a family that was married. And it was around that time that I suppose my journey into the underworld started. I didn't realize until I was in my mid-30s that I actually had a choice. Growing up in a predominantly Christian family in a former British colony, Jamaica, my parents did the best they could based on what they know. And so that translated to giving me a solid education, making sure I had a roof over my head, teaching me the basic principles of life, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, etc. And so I became the dutiful daughter, as it were, an only child. I adored my father. And so my life became driven by wanting to please my parents, particularly my father. I'm sure many of you can resonate with that. So fast forward to going to live in Canada at the age of 16. And this was where I met racism or racialism. And I will expound on these terms that I use as we go along for the first time. Even though Jamaica's motto is out of many one people, we are a predominantly Black country. We have an impressionable Chinese population, Indian population, Portuguese Jewish population, and those came at the end of slavery to fill certain slots. So I arrive in Lillywhite, Ontario. I am put into the Holy Name of Mary High School for Girls, a Catholic school, and I am one of 2 Black students. And so my classmates would ask me things like, did I live in a grass hut in Jamaica? Did I hang from trees? Did I wear grass skirts? And naturally, I found these questions offensive. But what I didn't realize is at the impressionable age of 16, the seed that was being planted of being different, of being less than, of being almost animal-like. And then I moved to New York when I started with the UN. And interestingly enough, one of the first overt racial/cultural experiences that I had came from an African-American woman. I have an accent, which I'm very proud of. And we were on the subway and I must have said something. And she said to me, why don't you get back on your banana boat and go back from whence you came? And I went, wow, okay. So even though we may have looked alike, clearly there were some cultural differences. So returning or diving deeper into the yoga story. I left Holland in 2005, went to live in Sudan, also working with the United Nations. And when I arrived in Sudan, I experienced what I can only describe as culture shock. I had not seen, living in the Netherlands, living in The Hague, the political capital of the Netherlands, it wasn't until I arrived in Holland that I realized that I had actually not seen Black babies for 7 years. I was living in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, most of the people of African descent came from the Dutch Antilles, and they tended to live in Rotterdam. And so the Netherlands was where I began to experience what I call covert racism. So for example, I would go to wash my car on a Sunday. I had a luxury car. I was in the corporate world, you know, climbing that corporate ladder of success. You know, I had the master's degree. I had the apartment. I had the luxury car, the designer clothes. And the only thing left to fill in was that husband and the 2.2 children. And I remember going to the car wash one Sunday morning and the attendant saying to me there, oh, you've come to wash your boss's car. And I was flabbergasted. I had a beautiful, beautiful, still a dear friend of mine, Dutch male attendant, tall, 6'3". And Robert and I would show up to meetings, you know, with corporations, with the Dutch government, and with a last name like McNeil. This was not what they were expecting to see. So they would turn to Robert and say, oh, this must be your assistant. Where is Ms. McNeil? And Robert would laugh and says, no, no, no. This is Ms. McNeil. So this is what I describe as covert racism shows up everywhere and when we least expect it. So, yoga. After my relationship fell apart, after I did Landmark, after I started, well, actually no, the yoga was after Landmark. But as my yoga practice deepened, I knew that I wanted to learn more about this thing that was having a subtle yet profound impact on my life. By this stage, I was now here in Indonesia working with UNICEF. I was headquartered in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, and I traveled a fair bit across the country. I came here following the 2004 tsunami, spent a fair bit of time in Aceh, Banda Aceh in Sumatra. And so at the end of my contract with UNICEF, I went off to India. Now, before I shared the experience in India, while I was here in Indonesia around 2006, I remember being on a response effort. This was for the earthquake in Yogyakarta. And I started to have physical symptoms that I couldn't explain. Now, working in the field of emergency preparedness and disaster management is predominantly a male normative function, a white male normative function. So it was unusual to have a woman in such a position, in a senior position, as well as having a Black woman in this position. And so one of the conditionings that many of us as women share, and I would say it is even more so for women of color, is this thing that we have to prove ourselves and we have to work really hard. And so if we're not working really hard, then what we're doing doesn't make sense. Anyway, we're preparing to do this relief response, first responders to land in Yogyakarta. We've been on the tarmac all day, we've been at the airport, and I remember like I started to see stars and my stomach started to go flip-flop and my knees felt a little bit wobbly, and I, kind of tried to ignore it. And I said to one of my colleagues at the time, a male colleague, I said, I'm not feeling so well. And he kind of dismisses me and he says, oh, you'll be fine. Once you get to Yogyakarta, everything will be okay. You're now just running on adrenaline. And of course, as women, we know what happens when we are on adrenal overdrive. It is our hormonal system that gets affected. So we get on the cargo aircraft, C-160 aircraft. We have all of the relief supplies, and the plane starts to taxi down the runway, and these stars and weird feelings become even more pronounced. So I go to the person, I said to him, I actually don't think I can do this. And he says, do what? I says, do this aircraft, this relief response. And he said to me, do you realize what you're asking me to do? I said, absolutely. Now, the impact of this was, in the politics of relief work, every agency wants to be the first on the ground. So we had jumped through major hoops to get overflight and landing clearances. Now we're about to take off, and I'm asking them to turn the aircraft around. Anyway, they did. When we turned back, the ambulance was there. By the time they got me to some medical center, my blood pressure was something like 180 something over 120 something, which, as we know, is on the verge of a stroke. And as the doctors told me this, I laughed, because that's my response when I'm scared, is that I laugh. Anyway, I was given some medication, some blood pressure medication. The drug of that time for anxiety was Xanax. And I went back to the hotel, took the medication, managed to calm myself down. And the following day, I took another aircraft, went to Yogyakarta, and did that emergency response high as a kite. One thing I said to myself, though, was that I was not prepared to spend my life on medication, so I was going to sort this out. So upon my return to Jakarta, I went to see several doctors. They didn't know what was wrong with me. They tested me for everything from HIV/AIDS to typhoid, and even the testing of HIV/AIDS. I remember the doctor calling me at home one evening and she says, "Have you ever done an AIDS test?" I kind of went, wow. And she says, "Well, you know, you have been in Africa and you are of Caribbean descent. So you can see the covert racialism coming in there." In any event, I did not have HIV/AIDS. I then went to see an Australian doctor who said to me, "Tell me something, when was the last time you had a holiday?" And I actually couldn't tell him. And I remember he said to me at that point, he said, "I would like you to take 3 weeks off. I'd like you to go to Bali and do absolutely nothing and then come back and see me." I'd been to Bali on a previous trip a couple of weeks or months earlier, and I'd met this yoga teacher. And as I sat scared alone in my house in Jakarta, Spirit led me to give him a call on the phone, and I told him what was happening. And he says, "Come." So I bought a one-way ticket to Bali. First time in my life I bought a one-way ticket. And I arrived here, and for 2 weeks I did nothing but pranayama and cry and pranayama. He would pick me up from my accommodation, stick me on the back of his bike, take me to the studio, and I did all of this breath work. And eventually my vitals stabilized. When I returned to Jakarta, I went to see the doctor. Everything was fine. And essentially what I had experienced was a breakdown, a breakthrough, burnout, whatever you choose to call it. But I do remember him looking at me and saying, "The next time you might be so lucky." So my yoga practice became my refuge and my strength. As my journey deepened towards the end of my contract with UNICEF, I decided I wanted to learn more about yoga. And so I headed to the Shivananda ashram in India. And that was, in a word, life transforming. When I decided I wanted to deepen my knowledge, or my quest in yoga, as it were, in those days, back in 2008, and I guess it's still much the same way now, the only way you could do that was through a teacher training. It was never my intention to become a yoga teacher. So here I am at the ashram in India. There are 200 people signed up for my training from all over the world. And again, 2 people of color, myself and a young woman from Harlem in New York. And I learned so many things about myself, about life while going through that training. But one of the things that really shifted for me, I remember one afternoon witnessing a group of Iranian women covered in hijab and a group of Israeli men with their beanies on their heads. I think they're called yarmulks. And I watched these 2 groups of people on either side of the assembly hall. And I watched them do this and this and this and this. And eventually they did this. And I went, wow. So after almost 20 years at that point of UN service, having sat in several Security Council meetings, General Assembly meetings, I was witnessing before my eyes 2 nations, 2 opposing groups of people come together to seek to understand rather than to be understood. And in that instant, I recognized yoga is a viable tool for global peace. At the end of my training, when I received my certificate from the Swami, he said to me, "You must start teaching immediately." And I looked behind me because he certainly could not have been speaking to me. I returned to Jamaica And slowly, slowly, I started to offer yoga in orphanages, in girls' homes, in prisons. And so my segue into the world of yoga, as it were, was through my karma yoga. And one of the things that really became apparent for me in that point was many of us as aid workers serving in the field of humanitarianism, we are dealing with our own crises. And so it is important that we do our own work, put the gas mask on self first before assisting others. Because if we have not done our own work and we go into the field and we are triggered, then we're of no use to ourselves or the beneficiaries that we're trying to serve. At that point, the UN system had very little support infrastructure built in. Yes, there was a guidance counselor or wellness committee or whatever you want to call it, but there wasn't a daily integrated modality that helped us to support ourselves as we were dealing with these highly abject conditions. So, January 2010, the 12th of January 2010, massive earthquake hits Haiti. In fact, I was in Indonesia when that earthquake struck. I was planning to move to Indonesia at that point, to move to Bali. And I remember a dear friend of mine called me from Jamaica and she says, "Have you heard about this earthquake?" And at the time I hadn't. I was due to leave Indonesia that following day. And so by the time I landed back in Jamaica, and I remember her saying to me, and she's a dear friend of both Bex and I, Megan Pappenheim. I remember her saying to me, "Nadine, you've got to go and help Haiti. Bali will always be here for you." And so by the time I landed in Jamaica, I had assembled a team. And 7 days later, we went in and we did a reconnaissance to Haiti. And Haiti really rocked my world. Haiti is 45 minutes down the road from Jamaica. And Haiti is one of these Caribbean islands that has suffered and suffered again. Some of you may be aware of the fact that Haiti was not granted independence. Haiti fought for its liberation. Very powerful country. And so many of the people that I was serving again in Haiti, as in Sudan, looked like me. The aid world, or the first world aid world, tends to be made up of predominantly people of Caucasian descent. And so one would think that me going into these areas, into Africa, into the Caribbean, that I would be readily accepted. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. And that was confronting even for me. And I remember standing in the middle of a rubble in a church in Haiti. And it dawned on me the weight of my blessings. The only difference between what was happening in Haiti, what I had witnessed in Somalia, what I had witnessed in Sudan, was a boat ride. My ancestors happened to survive an arduous boat ride and arrived in Jamaica, and here I am. So I have a karmic, an intergenerational responsibility and duty to give back where I can. I served in Haiti for about 9 months, and then following Haiti, I returned to the UN and I was posted in the Central African Republic. In 1998, the Central African Republic was considered the 4th poorest country in the world. I remember when I was heading off to CAR, as it's called, I said to my boss, I would say to people, "Oh, I'm going to CAR." And when I say people, colleagues, and they'd kind of look at me like, "Really?" And I remember talking to my boss one day on the phone, and I said, "Oh my goodness, after Haiti, nothing can possibly be worse than Haiti." Said to me, "Nadine, CAR is a whole different kettle of fish." In Kar, there was one main road in the capital, Bangui. And to put it in context, the Central African Republic, Bangui, the capital, had its first street light installed in 1998. So you get the picture. While I was in Kar as head of operations, what kept me going was my yoga practice. Daily, I would get on that mat. And I started to offer yoga in the communities there. And I remember a colleague of mine saying to me one day, I don't know how you do all of the work that you do and then show up to teach us yoga in the evening. And I remember my response to her was, Biljana, it is doing the yoga in the evening and in my morning that sustains me throughout the day. So shifting gears to what does it mean to be a woman of color or a woman in 2020? It is my firm belief that where we are today, the change that we are looking for in the world is in our hands, in our hearts, and in our wombs. As women, creatrixes, givers of life, we are the ones who can change the trajectory of how the world shows up. We are the ones that are birthing the next generation. We are the ones that are nurturing that generation. A couple days ago, I watched Becoming, Michelle Obama's documentary on her book. And one of the things she spoke about that really struck me, so much of that struck me, but the thing that really stood out for me was when she spoke about invisibility and transparency. We live in a world where to have a conversation on the topic of race and racialism borders on being politically incorrect. Yet it is important, it is necessary. Our lives depend on us having these conversations. And so throughout my life, you know, from going to school in Canada to working in the UN to being in the yoga world, repeatedly I would hear people say to me, oh, but I don't see color. And I know that that statement is made with the best of intentions, but it is impossible for us to not see color. To say to me that you do not see color invariably says that you do not see me, which means I am being made invisible. As women, we have been made invisible for too long. And part of that invisibility results in us remaining silent. Those days are over. Our voices must be heard. Much of the internalized anxiety and stress that we have endured comes from this business of invisibility. Being a Black woman, there are several layers to that. If I speak my truth, if I become emotional or passionate, slap, label, angry Black woman. Slap this label, woman from the hood. Slap another label. And ultimately, we all want to fit in. But really, is that what we want? I spent the bulk of my life trying to fit in. And as a result of trying to fit in, what I ultimately did was that I made myself small. The world doesn't need us making ourselves small. If you are on this training, there is something unique that you have to offer the world. It's what I call our DNA, our divine natural ability. And our jobs in this moment is to discover what that is and go and do it full out. For a very long time, I would be encouraged by friends, oh, Nadine, you must speak out. You have a voice, you have perspective, you have traveled the world. You can share these things with others. And I would go, well, you know, I don't want to become unpopular. I don't want to make others uncomfortable. Back to the people pleasing. My father died 2 years ago. And in his passing, that people pleaser also went. And so with a huge dose of courage and vulnerability, I am daring to take on these topics. Why? Because I know in every fiber of my being that humanity's survival and thriving depends on it. I had a conversation a couple of years ago with a friend of mine of Jamaican extraction. She's Jewish. And it was a very heated discussion. And she said to me, the only thing that's going to shift the race dynamic in America is when white women start to talk about race, or white people. And I was highly offended. You know, the rebel in me, the activist in me, the Jamaican in me, the lioness in me said to her, I don't need anyone to fight my battles. I can fight my own battles. And it took me a couple of years to understand actually what she was saying. And so how this translates for me, and I hearken back to that example of being in the ashram in India and observing the Israelis and the Iranians. There was a deep commitment on both sides to see each other and to understand each other and to learn from each other. The only way that can occur is when we dare to have conversations that make us a little bit uncomfortable. And from a place of grace and a place of love, stay in the discomfort to get to the breakthrough. The only way out is through. We cannot go around the bend. And this is why the world is largely finding itself in the place that it is. You know, the pandemic, be the pandemic what it is. What I believe it provides us is this tremendous portal for us to look at how we've been living, pausing and shifting that paradigm. Many of the issues that we have dealt with as women have been passed down to us intergenerationally. And let us acknowledge our matrilineal lineage for the journey that they took, the sacrifices that they made, so that we could vote, so that we could choose what we want to happen with our bodies, so that we could say no more to patriarchal abuse. You know, one of the people I think of, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was responsible for freeing thousands of slaves in the United States of America. And if you've not seen the film, I encourage you to see it, Harriet. And there's a part in the film where she talks about, I could have freed 1,000 more if they knew they were slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they knew they were slaves. Wow. So I've shared a bit, and I now I've provided a backdrop, and I now want to hone in on some key points here. The world of yoga. The world of yoga as we know it today, as we see it in studios, as we see it played to us on social media, tends to be a predominantly white female world. I am not the general face of yoga, as it were. Working at the yoga barn, what I refer to as the United Nations of Yoga, where people from all walks of life, people speaking different languages. We have people in our classes that English is not even their first tongue. They all show up to class. And so I recognize that as I hold the space as a teacher, it's not just asana that I'm teaching. I'm also teaching possibility, offering us a chance to dwell in infinite possibility, defying the stereotype. You know, this is one of the things that Michelle Obama spoke of, going to Ivy League schools, going to Princeton and Harvard, where she recognized that this was not just about her. For her to move through this, become this kick-ass lawyer, marry the first president of the United States of color, to be the first lady of color, she was sending a message to little boys and girls across the world of what was possible for them. And one of the things that I loved that she spoke about that kept her grounded was that first and foremost, she was a mother. You know, so yes, while it was daunting to be going into the White House, she wanted to know that her two little girls were also going to be safe. They would have as normal a life as they could. They'd be able to have play dates and sleepovers, etc. And so what did she do? She brought her matrilineal lineage along with her. She had her mother with her in the White House. There's an African proverb, it takes a village to raise a family. So she had that lineage with her so that her children were exposed to their culture and their lineage at a deep and cellular level. We have got to have this conversation about race, sisters. It is important. The term woman of color is a term that's all-encompassing. And what I like of that term is that we are all of color. For me, it is not offensive to be Black. It is who I am. It is the essence of who I am. I am that and so much more. The word privilege, this word that gets tossed around. What does privilege really mean? Privilege, for me, denotes accessibility. So, if we have access that others might not, how do we employ that access? How do we use that access to evoke change? I often have friends with young children who will come to me and say, you know, Nadine, can you speak to my kids about the issue of race? Because as mothers, we want to be raising children to let them know that they're first and foremost children. Children have a right to their innocence. From child abuse to child porn to child labor, so much of that innocence gets robbed from them. I read an article a few days ago where a Black mother was talking about her son. She said, you know, my little boy at the age of 7 years old is cute, but in about 5 years, he becomes a weapon of mass destruction. And so she shared in this article having to speak to her son at some point that when you go out there in America, you can't just act like any arbitrary little boy. Imagine that, innocence robbed. And she backs this up with some very humbling statistics. I believe it was in 2018, 24% of the men in America gunned down by police were Black. 13% of the entire US population is Black. We think of the Trayvon Martins in a hoodie. We think of the Aubrey Amber going for a jog. We think of the little boy, at 8 years old, playing with toy guns and being shot down. This has got to change. And the only way it's going to change is us, the givers of life, daring to have those conversations with ourselves and therefore with our children. This is uncomfortable. It's not easy, but there is support out there for this. And this is what the world is calling for now more than ever. Much of the work I do also revolves around women's work. I hold weekly women's circles, and women from all walks of life come to these circles. We have political analysts, we have mothers, we have goddesses, we have priestesses, we have grandmothers, we have maidens. Everyone shows up. And one of the things I love about this work is that we all get to teach and learn. Each one teach one. In the words of Kofi Annan, former Secretary General for the United Nations, and a man I was blessed to know personally, women hold up half the sky, which therefore means we have a voice at the table. If we look at this pandemic, the countries that seem to be managing well are those that are led by us as women. Because the female-centered approach to leadership is of centrarchy, it's of collaboration, it's of community, it's of nurturing. The old paradigm of competitiveness, of a scarcity consciousness model, is what triggers stress and anxiety. The stress and anxiety that we're experiencing in this time is born from a limited belief system that there is not enough for us to share. The only way out of this is that we're going to have to support and help each other. Individuality is a dead concept. So, one of the things we often hear in the topic of race is that we're all the same. We're not all the same. We're all fragmented, we're all different, we're all beautiful, we're all amazing, and we're all imperfect. And how we support each other is by acknowledging, celebrating, and respecting those differences. Because if you see me and I see you, then I am validated as I validate you. So, a bit of a reflection for you that I might invite you to journal about is, how can you, through heightened awareness and sensitivity, start to shift the dialogue within yourself and within your communities as it relates to race? You know, one of the things with this pandemic is we've heard this business, we're all in the same boat. We're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm. But some of us are in a dinghy, some of us are in a yacht, and some of us are on a cruise ship. But the reality is, whatever carrier you may be in, the landscape that this thing that we're living through is affecting is this body. And the body keeps the score. There's a discussion that I am certain is going to start to emerge. You can see it starting to pop up already about mental health, what's happening with our mental health. I saw Marianne Williamson post something the other day that as women, it is okay for us to be upset and to voice that upset. It's a very powerful point to make, because many of us have been raised that to be ladylike, you know, we sit and we're quiet and we don't raise our voices, etc., etc., etc. Raise your voice, ladies. Important. Your life and the life of so many others depend on it. So again, the reflection is, how can you, through your heightened awareness, as you sit with yourself, as you journey into your underworld, how can you shift the dialogue that's happening within yourself and your communities? As I have journeyed into my underworld, I have come front and center with myself, and some of what I've seen I'm not proud of. Some of the things I've told myself, some of the ways that I've played small, some of the ways I've not stepped up because I don't want to step on anyone's toes and upset anyone. For me, those days are over. The other thing that I would like to share is, what have you come to see about yourself that you didn't see before? What have you come to see about yourself that you hadn't seen before? Another big question. Because with our blessings and our freedom comes responsibility. Our ability to respond. So let us continue to use this time to really get clear with ourselves. Have the courage to share your first person story. If my sharing has provoked any thoughts for you and you wish to reach out, please do. You can always send me an email, info@universalempress.com. To learn more about my work, I invite you to visit my website, universalempress.com. And in closing, I acknowledge each and every one of you for showing up for yourself in this program. When one of us suffer, we all suffer. Yet, when one of us heal, we all heal. Thank you for the privilege. Namaste.